I stood in the back row of the cathedral, the scent of polished wood and incense heavy in the air, as the choir's voices rose above the hushed crowd. People whispered about legacy, about what would happen next, but no one whispered my name. Not once. This was the funeral of Richard Halloran, founder, CEO, visionary, and, to me, the only person in that company who had ever looked past appearances and politics. Richard had been more than just a boss. He was a mentor, a protector, someone who had told me quietly over coffee late one night, "Amy, you see what others miss. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Now he was gone, lowered into the ground with lilies on his casket, and in the front row sat his son, Daniel, surrounded by board members dressed in black. Their faces were masks of grief, carefully arranged for appearances, but I could see the calculation behind their eyes. To them, Richard's death wasn't just tragedy. It was an opening. Everyone assumed Daniel would inherit control. His jaw was set as if he were already wearing his father's crown. Whispers rippled through the cathedral. The transition will be smooth. The company will stay in the family. No one questioned it. No one looked at me. I kept my eyes down, my hands folded in silence. Because what they didn't know, what I couldn't reveal, not yet, was that Richard's final decision had changed everything. The memory of that night came back to me with brutal clarity. A week before his heart failed, Richard had called me into his office. The lights were dim, his voice weaker than usual, but steady. He slid a sealed envelope across the oak desk. "Amy," he said, "there will be chaos when I'm gone. You've seen how they circle. That's why I'm leaving this to you." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was his notarized will. My name stared back at me in black ink. Richard had not left control to his son. He had named me Amy Clark, the majority heir. I had looked at him, stunned. "Why me?" I whispered. "Because," he said, eyes burning even in his frailty. "You'll protect what I built. They'll underestimate you, Amy. That's your advantage." Now, standing at the back of his funeral, I heard his words again. They echoed through the cathedral louder than the organ. The board shifted in their seats, already whispering, already planning. Let them. The week that followed blurred into polite condolences and hushed conversations in glass offices I was suddenly excluded from. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were moved without me. By Friday afternoon, I was summoned to the executive conference room. The air inside smelled faintly of leather and stale coffee. The board sat in a neat row, Daniel at the head of the table, his mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Amy," the chairman began, voice dipped in false sympathy. "We've reviewed operations in light of recent changes. Unfortunately, we've decided your role has been made redundant, effective immediately." The words landed like stones. Once they would have broken me. Years ago, I might have begged, argued, pleaded to stay, but now all I felt was a strange calm. I smiled, just slightly. "I understand. Thank you for the opportunity." For a moment, silence hung in the room. They hadn't expected composure. They had expected tears, outrage, humiliation. Instead, I stood, gathered my belongings, and walked toward the door. "Security will escort you out," one of them said quickly, as though afraid I might lash out. In the elevator, my reflection stared back at me. Tired eyes, set jaw, lips curved into the faintest of smiles. They think I'm finished. How fun Monday would be. That night, in my small apartment, I placed the cardboard box of personal belongings on the floor. A photo of my mother. A pen I'd kept since my first day. A mug with a chipped handle. None of it mattered. The real inheritance, the one no one suspected, was locked safely in my desk drawer. The will. Richard's final signature. His trust in me. His belief that I could hold steady where others would falter. As I sat alone in the quiet, grief surged through me. Not for the job, not for the titles they stripped away, but for Richard himself. He had seen me when no one else did. When promotions passed me over, when my ideas were stolen, when I was told to smile more if I wanted to get ahead. Richard saw me. And now he had given me the one thing they could never take back: control. I poured a glass of wine, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere across town, the board was celebrating my departure, congratulating themselves on saving money, already dividing up what they thought was theirs. Let them laugh. Let them believe they'd erased me. Because by Monday morning, the truth would hit them like a storm. The offices they claimed as theirs, they were already mine. And this was only the beginning. The weekend stretched ahead of me like a quiet storm waiting to break. For the first time in years, I didn't have to set an alarm for Monday morning, didn't have to iron a blouse, didn't have to paste on a polite smile in the elevator. I should have felt lost. Instead, I felt something I hadn't in years: freedom. Still, the silence in my apartment was heavy. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues. Some polite, some not so polite. Amy, I'm so sorry. I heard they let you go. The board toasted to you being dead weight at the club last night. Daniel's bragging about streamlining operations. I read them all slowly, letting the words sink in. Dead weight, streamlining, celebrating. They had no idea. Not yet. On Saturday morning, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and pulled Richard's will from the drawer. The document was heavy in my hands, the notarized seal catching the light. I traced my name on the page. The letter's still unreal. He hadn't left it to Daniel. He hadn't left it to the board. He'd left it to me. A voice echoed in my head. Richard's voice, soft but certain. They'll underestimate you, Amy. That's your advantage. Let them move first. Then, strike, that became my mantra. By midday, the arrogance of the board was already spilling into the open. Nell, one of the few colleagues I trusted, sent me a message. They're planning to sell off one of the smaller divisions. Bryce is already talking about taking over Operations Perfect. The more reckless they became, the easier it would be to show investors the truth. But doubt crept in that evening as I sat in my quiet living room. Could I really face them? Men twice my age, polished in politics and manipulation, all convinced I was nothing but a disposable pawn. I thought about the times I had been talked over in meetings, when my ideas were credited to someone else, when I stayed late fixing problems others caused only to watch them promoted. The anger steadied me. Richard hadn't chosen me out of pity. He had chosen me because he knew I had the patience to wait and the foresight to plan. Saturday night, my phone rang. An unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Amy, a familiar voice said, smug and drawn out. It was Bryce, one of the oldest board members. I heard about your situation. Tough break. But look, if you're looking for opportunities, I can put in a word elsewhere. We have to look out for each other, right? I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I kept my tone flat. That's generous of you. He chuckled. Anyway, exciting times ahead. You know, fresh leadership, bold moves. Maybe I'll even be running things soon. Congratulations, Bryce, I said softly. I'm sure it'll be memorable. When I hung up, I couldn't stop smiling. He had no idea that by Monday, his words would come back to haunt him. On Sunday morning, I took a different step. I met with Emily Chen, the lawyer Richard had insisted I bring into confidence months ago. Sharp eyes, calm demeanor, the kind of professional who could dismantle a contract line by line. She reviewed the will again carefully, running her finger along the notarized seal. It's airtight, she said, her voice steady. They can try to challenge it, but with this documentation, the notary, the witnesses, the physician's statement confirming Richard was of sound mind, they won't get far. I exhaled, tension I hadn't realized I was carrying slipping from my shoulders. Patience, Emily said, echoing Richard's words. Don't rush. Let them make mistakes. When you strike, make it final. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment looking out at the city lights. Across town, I imagined the board laughing over their glasses of whiskey, congratulating each other for cutting costs, for finally putting me in my place. They thought Monday would be their victory lap. Instead, Monday would be the day they learned who truly held control. I poured myself a glass of wine and whispered Richard's words into the night. They'll underestimate you. That's your advantage, and they already had. By the time I went to bed, the doubt had faded. The fear had quieted. All that was left was the steady hum of anticipation. Tomorrow, I wouldn't walk into that building as an employee. I would walk in as the owner. And that thought carried me through the night. Monday morning came earlier than I expected. I woke before the alarm, the apartment silent except for the hum of the city outside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to rush. No hurried coffee, no checking emails before the elevator ride, no forced smiles in the lobby. Today was different. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat on my balcony, watching the streets below fill with people hurrying to jobs they hated. Across town, the board was likely already gathered in the executive conference room, congratulating themselves on streamlining operations. They thought I'd disappear quietly into unemployment, maybe beg for a reference, maybe fade into obscurity. Instead, I held something they couldn't even imagine. Control. By 8:30 a.m., I was dressed in a navy suit, understated, sharp, nothing flashy. I needed to look like what I was. Calm, prepared, inevitable. I slipped Richard's notarized will into my briefcase alongside Emily Chen's cover letter, citing my legal rights as majority heir. When I arrived at the building, security hesitated. After all, I'd been terminated. But when I handed them the sealed envelope with Emily's letterhead, their faces changed instantly. Within minutes, I was being escorted upstairs, not as an employee, but as something none of them had grasped yet. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, a wall of glass overlooking the skyline. The men around the table looked up in surprise as I entered. "What is she doing here?" Bryce muttered, his brow furrowing. I set my briefcase down gently, letting the silence stretch. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said evenly. "I believe I have every right to be here." The chairman cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Amy, this meeting is for board members only. As you know, your employment was terminated last week." Without a word, I slid the folder across the table. "Then you'll want to read this." Confusion flickered across his face as he opened it. His eyes scanned the notarized signatures, the legal seals, Richard's handwriting. His expression shifted from disbelief to something close to panic. The others leaned in, murmuring, their voices sharp whispers as they flipped through the pages. This can't be real," the chairman finally stammered. "It's very real," I replied calmly. 3 days before his death, Richard Halloran signed over his majority stake to me. That makes me the controlling shareholder of this company. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then Bryce slammed his fist on the table. "This is outrageous. You expect us to believe he'd hand control to you, of all people?" I met his glare without flinching. "Believe whatever you want. The paperwork is valid, witnessed, notarized, and already filed. I've spoken with my attorney. As of this moment, your authority is subject to my approval." The room erupted. Half the board began whispering frantically, while others rifled through the documents as if hoping to find a mistake. Bryce's voice cut through the noise, harsh and bitter. "She's bluffing. She has no experience, no standing. Richard would never trust her with this." "Funny," I said softly, leaning forward. "Because he did. And unlike you, Bryce, he valued results over politics." His face reddened. "You think you can just walk in here and take over?" "I don't think," I answered, my voice steady. "I know." The chairman raised a hand, trying to regain control. "Even if this arrangement is valid, surely you understand the challenges. Investors, clients, employees. This revelation could destabilize everything." I let the words hang for a beat before replying. "Destabilize or restore confidence?" Because let's be clear, without Richard, your house of cards was already collapsing. Declining margins, restless investors, deals slipping away. You've been painting over cracks while the foundation rotted. Richard knew it. That's why he chose me. The truth of my words silenced them more than the documents had. They knew I was right. Numbers didn't lie. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table. I let it ring, deliberately leaving the screen face up. The name flashing across it was one they all recognized. Anderson Holdings, our largest institutional investor. The timing couldn't have been better. "Excuse me," I said, answering the call in full view of the board. "Yes, this is Amy Clark." "Of course, I'll meet with you this afternoon. We'll discuss the company's future." I ended the call and set the phone down slowly. "They already know," I said quietly, "and they're ready to talk." The look on Bryce's face was priceless. A mix of shock and fear, the first cracks in his arrogance finally showing. For the next hour, the board scrambled, questioning the legality, arguing technicalities, trying to delay the inevitable. I answered each point calmly, citing the legal validations Emily had prepared. They could fight, they could stall, but they couldn't undo the fact. I was the majority shareholder. Finally, I stood, gathering my papers. "Gentlemen, I'll give you the rest of the day to adjust to the new reality. Tomorrow morning, we'll reconvene to discuss restructuring properly this time." Without waiting for a response, I left the boardroom. Outside, assistants and staff lined the hallway, pretending not to eavesdrop. Their eyes followed me as I walked past. I offered a small, calm smile. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of power settle into place. Not revenge, not yet. Something larger. Richard's words echoed in my mind. "They'll underestimate you, Amy. That's your advantage," and they had. Spectacularly. By noon, the emails began. First from the company secretary, then from outside counsel. Subject lines in all caps, phrases in bold. Contest, capacity, temporary restraining order. They were going to argue Richard hadn't been of sound mind when he signed the will. I'd expected it. Emily had too. Before I could call her, my phone vibrated again. "Nell, they're telling staff you forged documents. Bryce said you preyed on a dying man. HR asked ET to pull your emails." I stopped walking, staring at the message until my reflection in the screen looked like someone else. "Are they wiping records?" I typed back. "Trying." Head of InfoSec refused without a board resolution. He asked for GC sign-off. They don't have it, small spine, big moment. I exhaled. Emily picked up on the first ring. "They'll go after capacity," she said without hello. "We prepared for this." "You have the notary, the 2 witnesses, and the physician's letter from the same week. I'm filing for a status quo order. No asset sales, no personnel changes, no material contracts until ownership is resolved." "Delaware Chancery?" I asked. "Exactly. Judges there like preserving the current state. Focus on investors. I'll handle the fire hose." The elevator in Anderson Holdings' lobby smelled faintly of metal and lemon. I arrived at 2 p.m. sharp. The receptionist's smile was professional. The conference room was glass and quiet, the skyline a steel line behind it. Victoria Hale, early 50s, composed, eyes that missed nothing, shook my hand and sat. "We want stability, Ms. Clark," she said. "Not theater. Why should we support you?" I didn't talk about Betrayal. I talked about numbers. Cash burn is up 9% year over year. Realized revenue is flat. Client churn ticked from 6 to 8.5. The board's response has been cosmetic. Headcount optics, press releases, nothing operational. My 90-day plan is simple. Freeze non-essential spend, audit every auto-renew contract, move bonuses from bookings to gross margin, and set retention triage for the top 50 clients with named owners. "And operations?" she asked. "Interim COO with P and L discipline. 2 names Richard vetted, Sheila Park, ex-Riverton, and Adrian Cole, formerly Eastmark. Both are available for short-term mandates." She didn't blink. "Governance?" Refresh 3 seats by shareholder written consent. Install an independent audit chair in 30 days. Publish segment-level disclosure on our quarterly calls. And adopt a binding say-on-pay policy. I paused. If the court grants status quo and the will stands, I'll execute on day 1. Victoria folded her hands. Deliver the consent, name the interim COO, and brief us twice weekly. If the court holds the line, you'll have a support letter by morning. The breath I'd been holding finally left. Thank you. On the sidewalk, my phone buzzed. Nell again. A photo of a white envelope taped to the boardroom door. Service of shareholder written consent stamped in blue beneath it. Then a second photo of Bryce mid-argument, lips thin, eyes hard. They're rattled, she wrote. InfoSec just locked the email purge. GC finally intervened. Back at home, an email from Emily was waiting. A scanned letter on hospital letterhead signed by Richard's physician. Patient is of sound mind and fully oriented. Cleared to execute legal decisions. We had never wanted to use it. Now it was a shield. At 6:07 p.m., a push alert hit my phone. Industry ledger exclusive, fired, VP claims majority inheritance, board shocked. A senior source called me opportunistic and unstable. The word stung once. Then the burn cooled into focus. I forwarded the article to Victoria with a single line. We will not litigate in the press. Her reply came fast. Good answer. Emily and I met at her office at 7. She slid a 3-page document across the table. Shareholder written consent, she said. Remove directors A, B, and C. Appoint independent replacements. Ratify interim operating authority pending court confirmation. Process servers go at 8:15. I read every line, then signed, careful and slow. It felt like writing on glass. Precise. Irreversible. They'll try an emergency TRO, Emily said, capping her pen. We'll be in front of a vice-chancellor at 10 a.m. I've asked for a status quo order and an instruction that no corporate action occurs without your written consent. Will we get it? We have clean facts. Judges like clean facts. On my way out, my phone rang from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Bryce's voice followed, a mix of threat and faux concern. Amy, be reasonable. This will ruin you. Come in tomorrow and we'll find you a soft landing. I forwarded it to Emily with one word. Preserve. The city had shifted into its night rhythm by the time I reached our building. Through the glass of our offices, I could see silhouettes moving in the boardroom, hands cutting the air like blades. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed late fixing someone else's mess while those same silhouettes toasted each other across town. I pulled my coat tighter and kept walking. At 9:18 p.m., Nell texted. Staff rumor mill is wild. Daniel told someone you stole the company. People who ignored you for years are suddenly asking if you're hiring. I typed back, tell them to get sleep. Tomorrow is paperwork, not fireworks. It sounded like something Richard would say. I hoped he'd approve. Near midnight, I opened Richard's old notebook. He'd kept short arrows between names, shorthand so compact it looked like code. Next to Bryce. Short horizon, corner with timelines. Next to the chairman. Hates public embarrassment. Lean on process. Next to my name, one line. Steady hands. I placed the notebook beside my phone and stared at the ceiling until my heartbeat slowed to something steady, something usable. Power wasn't a roar. It was a pulse you learned to keep. At 7:02 the next morning, Emily texted. Hearing confirmed. 10 a.m., Court of Chancery. Dress plain. Speak once. Let me carry the water, I answered with a thumbs up and a single word. Ready. By 8:15, process servers had confirmed delivery. By 8:40, Anderson's draft support letter hit my inbox, conditional on status quo. At 9:03, the company secretary emailed a last-ditch request to delay any meeting pending clarity. I replied with one sentence Emily had written for me. All parties are bound to maintain the status quo pending court instruction. In the mirror, I adjusted the collar of a black jacket I'd worn to half a dozen budget meetings that never mattered. Today, it did. I wasn't walking into a fight to scream. I was walking in to hold a line. They had moved first. Now it was my turn to make it final. The courthouse steps were slick with rain that morning, the air damp and heavy. Inside, the corridors hummed with low voices and the shuffle of shoes against marble. At exactly 10 a.m., we filed into the Chancery courtroom. Emily walked ahead of me, her posture steady, every move precise. I kept my hands folded, remembering her advice. Speak once. Let me carry the water. Across the aisle sat the board's attorneys, faces drawn tight, papers spread across the table like shields. Bryce was there too, jaw clenched, whispering furiously to Daniel. They looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of panic had already begun to bend their shoulders. The hearing itself lasted barely 20 minutes. The board argued Richard hadn't been of sound mind when he signed the will, that I had manipulated him, that this transfer would destabilize the company. Emily rose with calm precision, citing the notarization, the physician's attestation, and 2 independent witness statements. She reminded the court that Delaware law favored preserving the status quo during disputes. The vice-chancellor leaned back, steepling his fingers. Until this matter is fully resolved, no material changes will occur without Ms. Clark's written consent. Status quo order granted his gavel came down softly, but in that moment it sounded like thunder. The board's last illusion of control shattered in a single sentence. Bryce's face went red. Daniel muttered something I couldn't hear. Emily gathered her papers without expression, but as we stepped out into the rain, she gave me the smallest nod. Clean win. Now go lead. At 11 o'clock sharp, I reconvened the board. This time, I didn't sit at the side. I sat at the head of the table. 3 new independent directors joined quietly, their presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere. The old guard glared, their outrage muted by the court order resting in my briefcase. I spoke plainly. The company belongs to its clients, its employees, and its shareholders, not to personal egos. That ends today, I turned to Bryce. Your resignation is effective immediately. Compensation frozen pending audit. His mouth opened, then closed again. Daniel looked at him, waiting for defiance, but none came. The chairman shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. For the first time in years, the room was silent, not because I had been talked over, but because they were forced to listen. By mid-afternoon, Anderson Holdings issued a statement of conditional support. Other investors followed. Staff received a company-wide email. Effective immediately, Amy Clark assumes authority as majority shareholder and interim chair. My inbox exploded with messages. Some congratulatory, some shocked, some scrambling to realign themselves. Nell's text made me laugh quietly. Never seen so many people suddenly remember your name. Yet as the day wore on and the adrenaline ebbed, I found myself sitting alone in my new office, Richard's old office, overlooking the city skyline. On the desk was a framed photo of him, smiling at a company picnic years ago. I touched the frame lightly, my throat tightening. It wasn't triumph, I felt. Not really. It was weight. Responsibility. Richard hadn't given me 51% to settle scores. He had done it because he believed I would protect what he built from being hollowed out by greed. I whispered into the quiet. I hope I did it right. The truth was, revenge had never been the goal. Justice was. And justice doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like patience, paperwork, and a steady hand at the table. As dusk settled, I walked the quiet halls of the building, remembering the years I had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had fired me to erase me. And in doing so, they handed me the one thing they could never take back. Control. I paused by the glass wall outside the boardroom, now empty, the city lights flickering beyond. Power wasn't loud. It wasn't fists on tables or shouting in corridors. It was a pulse, steady and quiet, waiting for the right moment to break into thunder. I locked the office door behind me that evening, the weight of the keys solid in my hand. Tomorrow would bring audits, investor calls, difficult conversations, and hard work. But for the first time, it would be on my terms. And that, more than anything, was the real victory. Clear your desk. We don't need you and your useless checklist. The new CFO smirked, loud enough for half the office to hear. The words cracked through the room like a whip. A couple of analysts froze mid-keystroke. Someone coughed just to break the silence. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just smiled. He thought he'd landed his first public kill. The man's name was Victor Hale, freshly imported from a bigger firm, shiny MBA, hair slicked back with the confidence of someone who believed arrogance was a leadership style. He strutted in like the company was his personal playground, and from the moment he arrived, he made it clear. People like me, quiet, methodical, the ones who checked every line in the contract, were obstacles, not assets. Procurement is dead weight, he barked, pacing in front of my desk as if it were a courtroom. We don't need binders, protocols, or these ridiculous checklists. He held up one of my printed compliance sheets like it was a used napkin. We need speed. People watched, eyes darting between me and him, waiting for me to cry, to plead, to make a scene. I did none of those things. Instead, I unplugged my USB from the back of my monitor, slid it into my purse as calmly as a waitress pocketing a tip, and packed my things. One framed certificate, a photo of my niece, a succulent I'd kept alive for 7 years. That was it. 14 years in the company reduced to a small box of items and a quiet smile. No tears, no scene. Just me handing my badge to HR and walking out the front door at 4:57 p.m. 3 minutes before the end of the workday. Because I refused to give them even an extra hour of unpaid labor. I had been with Bayrock Systems for 14 years. I wasn't loud, I wasn't flashy. But I was the spine of vendor risk. If a vendor slipped a dangerous clause into a contract, I caught it. If a compliance checkpoint was about to be missed, I flagged it before legal even blinked. I was the escalation officer for our biggest infrastructure vendor, the one handling 70% of our payment operations. That wasn't symbolic. That was lifeblood. But Victor never looked, never asked, never read the contracts he signed. He was too busy mocking my binders, my systems, my old-fashioned checklists. What he didn't know was this. Last year, when our vendor updated their protocols, I quietly renegotiated our service authorization addendum. That made me the only one who could greenlight emergency access. Not IT, not legal, not even the CEO. Just me. And thanks to Victor's little tantrum, that authority had just walked out the door in a pair of worn flats and a cardigan that said, "Retired but dangerous." When I reached the sidewalk, I didn't cry. I didn't call my sister. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt was clarity, because Victor hadn't fired deadweight. He'd fired the wiring, and when you rip out the wiring, the lights always go out. By the time I got home, I had already drafted an email to a contact at our vendor. Just a short note, professional, attached with the necessary documentation. Nothing dramatic. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to take revenge. All I had to do was let the system they signed collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. The thing about corporate executions? They're never clean. You think you're cutting a person, but you forget. Their work seeps into the wiring. I was the wiring. And Victor had no idea that in just a few days his smirk would curdle into panic. For now, though, I sat at my kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the evening sun hit the glass. 14 years of invisible labor dismissed in a single sentence. But invisibility has its advantages. They had erased my name from the payroll. But in the paperwork that mattered, the contracts, the escalation chains, the vendor protocols, my name was carved in bold letters. Amanda Torres, Sole authorized escalation officer. Victor thought he had removed a bottleneck. What he really did was toss the only key to the entire system into the trash. And in less than a week, when payments froze across Bayrock, the board would learn the truth the hard way. Because this wasn't just a job. It was a system. And I was the system. By Monday morning, Victor strutted into the leadership meeting like he'd just conquered Rome. He had his PowerPoint open before people even sat down. Slide 1. New era of efficiency. All caps Arial, no data source, just a fat red arrow pointing upward. I wasn't there, of course, but I didn't need to be. A friend in IT, Sam, sent me a screenshot with the message, "He really thinks you were the problem." On slide 2, Victor had drawn a bar graph comparing process times before Amanda versus after Amanda. No footnotes, no citations, just numbers he'd pulled from the ether, proof that firing me had magically accelerated the company. "Procurement bottlenecks are gone," he declared, grinning like a raccoon who had just found a buffet. "We're fast-tracking agility." Nobody clapped, but nobody dared to contradict him either. When someone fires a 14-year veteran in public, people learn quickly to stay quiet. Fear spreads faster than facts. By Tuesday, cracks had already appeared. Sam messaged me again. First big payment batch failed. Jenna's panicking Jenna was new, promoted from payroll assistant to AP lead just 3 weeks earlier. She wasn't trained for vendor compliance. She was smart, hardworking, but green. She'd flagged the issue right away. A red box had popped up in the system. Authorization missing. Escalation officer override required. Jenna asked Victor if she should route it through risk review. He waved her off. "We don't need red tape. Just process it," except she couldn't. The system wouldn't let her. By Wednesday, the whispers started. Travel reimbursements bounced back. Software renewals froze. A regional sales manager sent 6 unanswered emails to finance about a hotel payment blocking a client retreat. One particularly sharp vendor rep threatened to withhold cybersecurity services if payment didn't arrive by close of business. The building began to buzz. Not with productivity, but with unease. Slack channels filled with vague messages. Is procurement still handling vendor checks? Silence followed. Then someone from marketing dropped a dumpster fire GIF. Meanwhile, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open. Not working on my resume? No, not yet. Instead, I was watching vendor alerts roll in. Every failed payment, every flagged escalation landed in my personal archive. Why? Because I had mirrored every authorization chain for over a decade. People thought my checklists were old-fashioned. They weren't. They were precise, alphabetized, time-stamped. I had built the digital backbone no one else understood. Victor had fired a librarian without realizing the librarian also built the Dewey Decimal System. By Thursday morning, the chaos was undeniable. Payroll batches were stuck. Contractors complained. Even routine reimbursements got flagged. I heard from Sam again. He looked exhausted in the selfie he sent. Dark circles under his eyes, half-empty energy drink in the frame. His text read, "Every engineer says the same thing. The payment gateway isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. And it's waiting for one thing, your credential string. My override ID, hard-coded into the vendor's system. Can't they just replace it?" I asked. His reply came instantly. Not without vendor escalation. And guess who the vendor requires for escalation? You. I closed my eyes and exhaled. Somewhere across town, Victor was probably storming around his glass office, blaming interns and juniors for not fixing a simple system glitch. That's what men like him did. When reality didn't bend, they blamed the people holding it up. But it wasn't a glitch. It was protocol. I thought about the irony as I watered my succulent, the same one I carried out of the office. They had mocked my devotion to checklists, to binders, to careful signatures. But those checklists had kept the company alive, quietly, invisibly, for 14 years. And now, without me, the wires were exposed. Friday came like a storm. Vendors escalated directly to legal. One even froze active services. Another sent a formal notice citing non-responsiveness to escalation requests. Sam messaged me again. It's official. The vendor flagged Bayrock as non-compliant. For a company like Bayrock, that wasn't a small bruise. It was a gunshot wound. It meant frozen accounts, halted services, contracts under review. And yet, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Revenge wasn't the point. Not for me. What I wanted was simple. Recognition of value. Not just for myself, but for every quiet worker who ever got dismissed as useless while propping up the entire system. Because here's the truth. Companies forget. They forget the Christmas weekends you spend rewriting protocols to prevent a compliance breach. They forget the late nights, the vendor calls, the clauses caught just before disaster. They remember only the loudest voices, the flashiest presentations, until the lights go out. That Friday night, I sat in the glow of my lamp, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. In my inbox sat a fresh vendor notice. Immediate access restriction. Account suspended. Attached was a PDF with my name embedded in the clause language like a tattoo. Escalation Officer, Amanda Torres. I didn't smile. Not yet. I just saved it in a new folder on my desktop and named it something simple. Leverage log, entry 001. Because this wasn't just a story of incompetence. It was a story about power. Quiet, invisible power. And how quickly arrogance crumbles when it collides with structure. Victor thought he'd won. He thought speed mattered more than stability. But by the end of the week, his victory was already unraveling. The fuse had been lit. The only question now was how big the explosion would be. By Monday morning, the silence in Bayrock's finance wing was louder than any alarm. No reimbursements had cleared. Contractor invoices stacked up like unpaid parking tickets. Payroll was due in 3 days, and the system still flashed the same red warning. Escalation Officer, override required. Victor strutted into the board prep call 5 minutes late, sweating slightly but forcing a grin. He clicked through his slides, still the same ones he'd been using, with efficiency gains plastered across the top. It's a minor disruption, he said, waving his hand. Temporary vendor-side glitch. We've got it under control, but he didn't, and people knew it. One of the VPs asked quietly, "Is that why no one's been reimbursed since last Tuesday?" Victor chuckled nervously. "We're implementing an access patch through IT. Should be resolved within 48 hours. Except IT had already stopped replying to his emails. Sam told me in confidence that the engineers had run every test, checked every line of code. The system wasn't broken. It was locked, by design. And the only key was me. Meanwhile, at home, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of printed vendor notices. Each one highlighted the same root cause: termination of sole authorized escalation officer. My name appeared again and again, a quiet reminder that 14 years of invisible work couldn't just be erased with a smirk. I didn't rush. I didn't call them. I simply documented everything. Each alert, each notice, neatly logged and dated. Entry 002, entry 003, entry 004. Back at Bayrock, panic began to leak through the cracks. By Tuesday, the vendor calls had turned from polite inquiries to direct threats. One cybersecurity vendor suspended active monitoring. Another froze access to a regional payment pipeline. And then came the biggest blow. Infernet Global, the infrastructure vendor that processed 70% of Bayrock's payments, flagged the account as non-compliant. That word again. Non-compliant. Legal carried the printed notice into Victor's office. "Have you reviewed Clause 6.1 of the Service Authorization Addendum?" they asked. Victor didn't look up from his laptop. Clauses are legal fluff. Nobody enforces them, which, for the record, is something only con men and soon-to-be defendants ever say. On Wednesday, the whispers turned into full-blown murmurs. Department heads stopped sugarcoating the situation. Marketing couldn't pay contractors. Sales couldn't reimburse travel. HR had payroll batches bouncing back. Slack threads lit up with questions. Did we fire the person who ran compliance? One employee wrote in hashtag general. No one answered. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed. A LinkedIn message. Hi, Amanda. Sorry to bother. This is Tyler from Infernet Global. We're seeing an escalation issue on our end, and your name's still listed in the protocol binder. Are you still with Bayrock? I stared at the screen for a long moment. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I opened my private archive and checked the vendor dashboard. Sure enough, my credential string was still hard-coded into the system. PMBT 14RSR, active, required, irreplaceable. By Thursday, Victor's mask began to slip. He stormed into the finance bullpen, barking orders. Bypass the system. Push payments manually. We're not waiting on some outdated protocol. But the system didn't care about his orders. Every attempted override bounced back. Engineers explained, again, that the credential string was embedded at the vendor level. Not editable, not replaceable. The only way forward was escalation, and the only escalation officer listed was me. By Friday morning, even the board couldn't ignore it anymore. Legal counsel briefed them bluntly. Without Amanda Torres's override credentials, Infernet Global has suspended access. You cannot process payments, reimbursements, or vendor invoices. You're in breach of contract. The CEO, gray-haired and 3 weeks from retirement, rubbed his temples. Define breach. Meaning, legal said flatly, we are exposed to audits, penalties, and potential lawsuits. Unless the escalation officer reinstates access, the company cannot function. And still, Victor insisted, it's a systems error. We'll patch it. But no one believed him anymore. I, meanwhile, was calm. I'd spent my career holding the company together in silence. Now, my silence spoke louder than any protest. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't planning a comeback. What I was doing was preparing, building my leverage log, documenting everything. Because when the call finally came, and it would, Bayrock would learn a lesson that far too many companies forget. You don't fire the firewall and expect the system to stay secure. That weekend, I sat in my living room, a stack of vendor notices beside me, my cat curled on the couch. I highlighted another clause with my name in bold. Saved another PDF into the leverage folder. Victor had thought I was nothing but a checklist. But the truth was simpler, sharper. I wasn't the checklist. I was the system. And soon the board was going to find out exactly what that meant. Monday arrived like a report deadline you can't postpone. I woke early, opened my laptop, and stared at the growing spine of my leverage log. Each entry calm, factual, time-stamped. Vendors had escalated. Legal had printed. Finance had stalled. All roads led to the same line of text buried in a contract and branded with my name. At 8:42 a.m., Sam texted, "Emergency board call at 9. Infernet's CEO joining." Then a second message. "Victor says he's got it handled." I actually laughed, not out of cruelty, out of recognition. I've learned that arrogance always sounds the same right before it meets a wall. I wasn't invited to the call, obviously. But documents have a way of finding me. Legal, in their efficiency, had BCC'd the same compliance archive I built years ago and never fully shut off. So, while the board gathered behind their glass walls, I sat at my kitchen table, spooning cold yogurt and watching the edges of my work drift back into my inbox like tidewater. At 9:01, the meeting started. First, the perfunctory greetings. Then Victor, 5 minutes late, clearing his throat over a shaky connection. I pictured him tugging at his tie and smiling like a hostage who'd rehearsed the word temporary. "It's a minor disruption," he began. "We're deploying an access patch with IT." The general counsel didn't bother to hide the sigh. "There is no patch," she said. "The vendor has suspended access due to non-compliance with the Service Authorization Addendum, Clause 6.1. Victor cut in. "Clauses are procedural." We're operational silence, the kind with sharp edges. A chime. New participant joined. Elias Grant, CEO, Infernet Global. His voice carried that careful calm you hear from pilots during turbulence. "Thank you for making time," he said. "Let's keep this efficient." The CEO of Bayrock tried to get ahead of it. "Elias, we've had some internal transitions. We're ready to update our authorization chain and would appreciate a temporary lift while—" Elias raised a finger. I didn't see it, but I knew the gesture. It's universal among people who don't need volume to command a room. "Before we discuss timelines," he said, "I need to clarify a detail." Paper rustled. "Your gateway overrides require the signature of the designated escalation officer listed in your SAA." A beat. Here it reads, Amanda Torres. There it was. My name, spoken in a room I hadn't been allowed to enter for months before I left. Victor coughed. "She's no longer with the company." Elias paused. When he spoke, his voice warmed by a degree. "Right. That explains the failures we saw starting Tuesday." Another rustle, then a sound I'll never forget. Gentle, surprised, edged with genuine disbelief. He laughed. "Wait," he said, not unkindly. "You fired your what?" I could almost hear the boardroom exhale, the split second where everyone checked if anyone else would confess to having missed the obvious. No one did. Elias continued, professional again. "Ms. Torres's credential string is embedded in the onboarding protocol. You approved the revision last year, more paper. Any reassignment requires her authorization or a full re-execution cycle. 90 days. Cross-departmental sign-off. Technical revalidation. You cannot pay vendors, reimburse employees, or complete renewals without that chain." The Bayrock CEO tried to retake the wheel. "Is there any interim option?" "There is a path forward," Elias said. "Ms. Torres has already provided us documentation of her credential lineage and prior approvals. She contacted our legal office on Friday. We're reviewing a continuity proposal." My phone buzzed. A new email. Infernet Legal. Receipt confirmed. I'd seen it 2 days ago. Seeing it again, mid-call, felt like a second confirmation. Of facts, of value, of the quiet weight of work. Victor attempted one last bluff. "We're prepared to submit updated signatories." "No," Elias said softly. "You submitted backdated forms this morning. Our counsel declined. We don't process fraud." Sam texted me a single word. Yikes. Elias shifted tone, not cruel, just precise. "When someone builds the system, don't be surprised when they know how to protect it. Ms. Torres built yours. She kept you off 2 federal audit lists in the last 5 years. You probably didn't know I felt that one. Not because of the praise, because it was true, and because the room that should have known had never cared to ask." Legal slid something across the table. I could hear the faint scrape in the recording that later reached my archive. The general counsel read, "Every service addendum since 2019 lists Amanda Torres as the sole escalation officer. Her signature appears on all overrides. We did not notify the vendor of her termination. We did not reassign credentials." "Then fix it," the CEO said, but it sounded like habit, not instruction. Victor spoke again, voice smaller now. "She was process, not strategy." Elias didn't raise his volume. He didn't need to. If process fails, strategy is bankruptcy. No one argued. The call ended with action items that weren't really actions. Coordinate with vendor. Assess exposure. Prepare external messaging. They're the phrases companies say when they've already lost the first battle and are pretending it's still halftime. I closed my laptop. My apartment was quiet. The steady hum of the fridge, the soft thud of my cat landing on a chair. I made tea. The kettle clicked off. If you're watching this and you've ever been told your work is just a checklist, hear me. Checklists are promises. Every box is a barrier against chaos. Systems don't fail suddenly. They fail exactly where someone decided a promise didn't matter. At noon, a new email arrived from Infernet's executive office. Subject: Consulting engagement, continuity and oversight. The proposed role: Independent vendor liaison, authority to restore access at my discretion. Terms fair, rate generous, scope mine to define. I didn't gloat. I didn't screenshot it for friends. I added it to the leverage log and wrote a single line beneath. Value is only invisible to people who don't do the work. Back at Bayrock, they drafted a second emergency call for the afternoon. I wasn't on it either. I didn't need to be. The room would look the same. Tired faces, quiet legal, Victor avoiding eye contact with the future. By evening, Tyler from the vendor texted, "If you're up for it, we'd like you on a call tomorrow to outline restoration steps." Your timeline, I stared at the message, then typed back, "I'll send terms in the morning." Because this isn't about revenge, it never was. This is about naming the work and then pricing it. And if they want the lights back on, they'll read the checklist. Out loud. Tuesday morning, I woke before my alarm. The apartment was quiet in that way cities sometimes are after a storm. Traffic there, but dulled. The air lighter. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and read the subject line waiting at the top of my inbox. Consulting engagement. Continuity and oversight. Final terms. I read slowly, not because I needed to, but because I could. Scope. Restore access, revalidate credential chains, audit controls, train successors. Authority, mine. Rate, generous. Duration, flexible, with an annual retainer. I added it to the leverage log, then drafted a short reply to Infranet's legal team. Accepted. Beginning today, I attached my NDA and a single-page implementation plan with my initials in the corner. A habit, a promise to myself. At 9:30 a.m., Tyler looped me into a vendor-side kickoff. No drama, just names, roles, and a clear goal. Get Bayrock operational without compromising the protocols that kept them safe. I listened more than I spoke. When it was my turn, I outlined next steps. Verify the credential lineage, rebuild escalation routing, temporarily proxy my token while reassignments are vetted, and set up a dual control process so no one person could ever pull what Victor tried again. Tyler exhaled audibly. "I've missed this voice," he said. Then, more formally, "We'll follow your runbook." At 11:02 a.m., Bayrock's CEO emailed me directly. No subject fluff, no exclamation points. Cool, professional, and tired. "Amanda, we request your assistance. We will accept your terms." I stared at the sentence longer than I expected. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was relief, like watching a building stop swaying after the earthquake subsides. I replied with a list. Not revenge. Requirements. 1. Acknowledgement in writing, filed with the board minutes, that the escalation chain was built correctly and failed because leadership ignored it. 2. A stipend for the contractors and employees who'd waited on reimbursements, paid immediately upon restoration. 3. Protection for the juniors who'd been scapegoated. Jenna in AP, Milo in IT. No retaliatory reviews, no performance improvement plans. 4. Mandatory training for executives on vendor risk, taught by me, recorded, and added to onboarding for future leaders. 5. A commitment to a culture change in writing. Checklists are not optional. They are policy. I read it again. None of it was flashy. All of it was structural. The CEO called at 11:19 a.m. His voice was rough at the edges. "We'll sign." All of it. There was a pause. I heard him inhale, then say quietly, "I'm sorry, Amanda." I believed him enough to continue. By early afternoon, I had a temporary proxy in place with Infranet. We validated the chain, tested a dummy payment in the sandbox, then a small live reimbursement. $100 to a sales rep who'd been floating hotel charges on a personal card. It cleared in seconds. In the Slack export I received later, someone posted a single confetti emoji in general. Then another person typed, "We're back." I didn't smile yet. It wasn't fixed. It was moving. At 2:40 p.m., I joined a joint call. Me on vendor side, Bayrock on theirs. Legal, finance, operations, no Victor. HR had sent the email that morning. Effective immediately, Mr. Hale has resigned. Resigned is a corporate verb with flexible geometry. I let it pass. The meeting was clinical, which is how restoration should feel. I walked them through the map they'd chosen not to read. Where escalation sits, why dual control exists, how overrides leave audit trails. I watched shoulders loosen as process replaced panic. When we got to the last slide, ownership, I didn't overplay it. I just said, what went wrong wasn't a system error. It was a choice, no one argued. We staged the releases, reimbursements first, then vendor invoices by tier, then renewals with continuity clauses. Each step verified, logged, checked twice. By 5:12 p.m., the largest stuck payment, a renewal for the cybersecurity partner, pushed through. They restored monitoring within the hour. The dashboard slid from red to amber, then settled on a steady green. It wasn't dramatic. It was a dimmer switch turning the room back on. I closed my laptop and let the quiet come back. My cat thumped onto the chair opposite me and settled like a paperweight. Outside, the late sun found the spine of my succulent and lit up a thin seam along one leaf I'd thought was gone. It wasn't. It was just healing. That night, the board sent me a countersigned letter fulfilling the 5 conditions. The stipend hit accounts. Jenna wrote me a thank you that I didn't deserve but saved anyway. Milo changed his LinkedIn headline back to something that sounded like hope. Sam texted, "Drinks on me when you want them." I told him I'd bring a checklist for the bar. Sometime after 9, I opened the file where I keep phrases I've heard about my work. Useless. Old-fashioned. Just process. Underneath, I typed a new line. Process is how people keep their promises to each other. I didn't go back to Bayrock. I didn't need to. My consulting agreement sat with the vendor now. My calendar filled with audits, trainings, and the kind of work that keeps things boring in the best possible way. When the world is quiet, the systems are working. If you're watching this, and you've been told your value is small because your work isn't loud, hear me. You are not background. You are the wiring. And when someone laughs at the checklist, remember, they're laughing at the thing that keeps the lights on. Wednesday morning, the CEO sent one final note. We've posted a policy change. Checklists are now mandatory for all executive decisions involving vendors. Required sign-off. Compliance, legal, and operations. There was a PDF attached with my framework. The one I'd built in evenings and weekends, in the long, quiet hours after someone else's meeting ran over my calendar. I made coffee. I watched steam rise. I let myself smile, small and private. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about recognition, about the quiet architecture of trust, about the cost of pretending the boring parts don't matter. I signed the last page of my vendor runbook and closed the binder. The spine cracked the way a well-used book does, not breaking, just settling. Clear your desk, he'd said. I did. And then I drew the map they'll use long after anyone remembers our names.